to my channel. I'm Ayla, and in this video today, if you couldn't guess it from the title, I'm gonna talk about some books. So you might be wondering, what is Books, Glorious Books? Well, it's this new video series that I'm gonna do on my channel, which is going to be kind of like a wrap-up, sort of this review roulette series, except instead of being dependent on time, so that you'll get a video every month, 2 weeks, 1 week. This series is dependent on the amount of books that I read, which means that you will get a video every 5 to 7 books that I read. What does this mean? This means that you could get another video in this review series next week. You might get another video in this review series in 2 months' time. It really just depends on the amount that I read. So once we established that, I can start off with this video. Now, sometimes I might have a theme, and in this video, the theme is randomness and spontaneity. Lately, I've been having a hard time deciding what book I want to read or what I'm in the mood for. I want to read everything and I want to read nothing at the same time. So I decided that I'm going to leave this up to fate or God or karma or whatever, or as I like to call it, the random.org calculator. Basically, I type in the amount of shelves that I have and I kind of guess the amount of books that I have on each shelf, and then I see what the calculator chooses out for me. The first sort of book that I read was Paris Sketchbook by Jason Brooks. This is a sort of travel journal and sketchbook combined that Jason Brooks created over a course of a couple of visits to Paris. Jason Brooks is a very well-known fashion illustrator who has done some very interesting and beautiful sketches for magazines like British Vogue and Elle. For example, here is just one of the many beautiful pages of this book. Or this page, for example, which is definitely my favorite. As someone who has been to her city herself before, I can totally get what he was trying to get across, the atmosphere and just the magical vibe that this city has. I think that he was able to capture it really well with his sketches and with the little bits and pieces that he wrote into this book, and I'm going to give it a 5 out of 5 stars. I then read 2 issues from the Convergence series, which is published by DC Comics, the first being Suicide Squad issue 1 and the second being Suicide Squad issue 2, and this is a sort of mini-series inside this overall series called Convergence. Since I only read 2 issues, I don't feel like I can say much about them except that they were enjoyable, but I do not recommend starting here with a Convergence series or with Suicide Squad. You'll kind of end up starting in the middle of everything, and if you have not read any issues from the Convergence series, or if you don't know anything about Suicide Squad, you will just not understand anything that goes on in these 2 issues. After those 2, well, 3 bookish things that were quite light and easy to read, I read an entire trilogy. The Shadowmagic Trilogy by John Lenihan. I would describe this as a Lord of the Rings parody if it was set in an enchanted world that had the tone of Percy Jackson except having Irish folklore instead of Greek mythology in it. This to me felt very much like a sitcom. It was nice but predictable and convenient for the characters, and it didn't really stand out that much. For me, plot-wise, it didn't feel substantial enough for an entire trilogy, and the ending was really not satisfying to the point that it was borderline dumb. I do know that this has actually gotten a lot of success on the web, which was why it eventually got published in physical form and in an entire binder, and while I do feel like this is a sort of fun trilogy, it just felt very meh to me. And fate had it, well, more like the random.org calculator had it, that I will continue on to start another trilogy. And that trilogy is the Black Magician Trilogy by Trudy Canavan, and I read the first book in that trilogy, which is The Magician's Guild. This is a dual perspective YA fantasy book, and it is told from the 2 perspectives of a middle-aged magician and a teenage girl. Now, we start off the story with our teenage girl finding out that she can wield magic, considering the fact that she comes from a low social economic class in this magical kingdom. It takes everybody by surprise, since up until then, no person that wasn't noble was able to actually wield magic and perform magic. So that sets off this huge chain of events that we follow in this book and will probably follow in the other two books in the trilogy. Now, you could definitely tell that this was a 90s fantasy book. A lot of the things that were done today would find very tropey, but they were done in a way that I think that somebody who reads a lot of YA fantasy books would be able to recognize that it wasn't a play on the trope, but rather what is supposed to be this very original, very unique kind of story. One of the ways that you could definitely tell that was the pacing. I felt the pacing of the story is very different than what you would expect today from a YA fantasy book, the first one in a trilogy that has the whole "you're the chosen one" theme to it. And considering that, I actually ended up quite loving this book. The characters, the relationships, the world building. I really loved everything that had to do with this book, and I'm quite looking forward to continuing on with the series. But as I said, the pacing was a bit off for my taste, so I'm gonna give this a 4 out of 5 stars. I then read a book that was quite different in tone from that book, and it was Chloe Doe by Suzanne Phillips. This book is told from the perspective of a teenage hooker. She's talking to her therapist and working on herself and coming to terms with how she came to the point that she is in her life and how she can actually help herself if even she can do that. And I quite enjoyed it, even though it was quite short. Again, it's only like 188 pages, but it reads so much more like this really short novella, just a part of the larger story. And I feel like everything that it lacked was made up by the beautiful writing style that Suzanne Phillips demonstrated in this book. It was this sort of stream of conscience in a sense, and I quite adored the way that the story was told. It felt kind of like this jigsaw puzzle that is slowly being put into place, and you slowly start like connecting all the dots and understanding Chloe Doe more and more. Which is why I'm just gonna sum this up in one word, and that is beautiful. The last book that I read was definitely my favorite out of the bunch, and that book is While Beauty Slept by Elizabeth Blackwell. If you couldn't guess it, this is a Sleepy Beauty retelling, but this is not told from one of the perspectives of the key characters in the Sleepy Beauty fairy tale, but rather from this entirely made-up character who is a maid called Lise. Now the story starts off with Lise being this very old woman who happens to hear her great-granddaughter telling the fairy tale of Sleeping Beauty to her siblings. Upon hearing the way that the story is told, she decides that she has to sit down her great-granddaughter and tell her what really happened in order to make sure that the story doesn't die with her. So this is kind of her retelling her entire life, and she starts with the first events that really pushed her towards the castle life, and then we follow her throughout the entire time that she served the castle and the royal family. This is definitely the best fairy tale retelling I read this year, let alone one of the best I ever read, and I can pinpoint that to 3 different reasons. First of all, I think that it was so smart for Elizabeth Blackwell to have her narrative not be one of the key characters in the fairy tale. Considering the way that she retold her fairy tale, I don't think that the perspective of one of the key characters would have been able to give us that big picture and that whole complete tale that we get from Elise's perspective. As well as if we would have gotten it from multi-perspectives, I think would have destroyed the magic of this story. The second reason that I really love this book had to do with the setting. The Sleepy Beauty fairy tale has this early medieval European setting, and Elizabeth Blackwell was able to capture that perfectly. And the third reason, the one that I appreciated the most, was the fact that while reading this book, once you finish reading this book, and afterwards when you think back upon this book, you as a reader are never quite sure if magic was a legit thing in this story. Elizabeth Blackwell definitely hints at the fact that some of the characters in the story possess magic, but it's never explicitly stated, and I think that it it was quite a daring thing for Elizabeth Blackwell to do, because a fairy tale very much depends upon its magical aspect. The moment that you take that magical aspect away from the story, you have to be much more creative in how you make your characters and your plot fit into the fairy tale formula of the specific fairy tale that you chose to be told. And the way that she made all the different elements happen in the story without there actually being legit magic in it was just so clever in my eyes and so neat. And I remember like reading how the curse was done and how like the magical fairies was done. And I'm like, this is so clever. I really appreciated that aspect of the book, and I think that is definitely the aspect that makes it stand out from the other fairy tale retellings that I've read, since nearly all of them, I don't think I can remember any other one didn't have magic in it. Like, they all had some sort of magic in it, some sort of magical character, some sort of whimsical thing. When you combined that, the aspect that just there's not legit magic in here, with the setting, it made the book feel like much more of a historical fiction novel than this fairy tale retelling, which I also think gave it this really interesting vibe. But I do want to give this a 4.75 and not a 5 out of 5 stars. And the reason for that is that the middle part of this book is very much about Lisa and her sweetheart, her first love. And I didn't care much for that character. Neither did I care much for that relationship. So that part of the book dragged just a bit, in my opinion, which is why I couldn't give it that full 5 out of 5 stars. So those were all the books that I read recently. What did you read? Let me know down below in the comments. I will leave links to all of the books that I mentioned down below in the description box. I hope you have a lovely day. I will see you in my next video. So, goodbye!